Recording.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. We have a really big group, and it is so great to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot, I'm not seeing your faces, but your names, of course, and a lot of new names as well. So welcome to the conversation tonight. We are talking about homegrown conservation, kind of through the lens of insects and pollinators and other wildlife. But I wanted to provide a little bit of context before we really jump into tonight's presentation. When I was asked to present here this evening, I was asked to present a sneak peek of a book that I'm writing for Timber Press by the same name as tonight's presentation, Homegrown Conservation. And the book that I am writing, some people are saying they cannot see me. Can other people see me? I'm wondering if that is a... Okay, so Amy said they can see me. Chuck says we can't see her. Maybe that's an issue. If you're like on a tablet or something, there should be a setting that allows you to see the speaker, or turn on like speaker view or something.
Yeah. Yep. If you're having a trouble seeing the presentation or Danae, it's usually it's an issue on your end, and it looks like the rest of everybody is able to see. So
perfect.
Yep.
All right. So again, I was asked to kind of present a little bit of a sneak peek of the book that I'm writing called Homegrown Conservation, which is taking a look at like 20 or so different actions that we can take in our own backyards to steward our landscapes to be more climate and wildlife friendly. That said, I am a macro insect and spider photographer. Most of my education, my writing, the books that I've written, most of them are about insects and spiders. So when Timber Press contacted me over the summer, they're like, hey, do you want to write a bug book? And I was like, yes, but I also want to write a book that more broadly encompasses just stewarding landscapes for insects, because so much of the conversation around pollinators and insect health and insect decline is so narrowly focused on just things like pollinators. And if we broaden that scope a little bit and talk more about stewarding our landscapes more broadly for nature and climate and wildlife, I think we're going to do ourselves so much better in the long run. And that's kind of how we're going to couch the conversation here this evening, is looking at kind of the big picture, but also kind of looking through that lens of insects and spiders. By the end of tonight's session, hopefully that will make sense. And we'll keep kind of coming back to that and revisiting this concept as we go through this evening. Please feel free to, again, post your questions in chat as we go along, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to address some of those questions at the end here. So here's what we know, and here's why we're talking about both climate change and biodiversity tonight. Climate change and biodiversity loss are creating existential threats to both people and nature. And why does this matter? Why does this matter for wildlife in particular? Because we are seeing massive declines in most animal species around the globe. We're seeing a 21% loss of reptile species, 27% loss in mammals, 40% of insects are in decline, 41% of amphibians, 50% of birds, and 50% of marine wildlife. Some ecosystems are being hit a little bit harder, particularly those like our ocean ecosystems, because it's not easy for ocean and marine mammals and bird species and things like that to just up and migrate, particularly those that live in aquatic systems. We're going to kind of couch our conversation with the insects, as we've talked about, because this is, after all, a pollinator symposium. So we know that insects are experiencing massive decline, which is really problematic. And why do we care? A lot of people who maybe aren't coming to this conversation through the lens of environmental conservation and protection might say, well, why do we need bugs anyway? Aren't they disgusting and bad? And they, mosquitoes spread disease, things bite us and sting us. Like, wouldn't a world without insects and spiders just be wonderful? And no, most of you who are probably coming here as gardeners, that a world without insects would be pretty terrible. So if you want to just type stuff into the chat, why do we need insects? What services do insects? And we'll throw spiders in there too. If you know me and you follow me on social media, I love my spiders. Why do we need insects and spiders? What good are they really? I'll wait for you guys to put some stuff in chat here. They provide food for wildlife, 100%. Decomposition, they pollinate, part of the food chain. You got it. They recycle dead vegetation, the nutrient recycle. See, you guys hit all of them. Bird food, they're part of the ecosystem, natural pest control. You hit everything that we were going to talk about. When we talk about the importance of insects, we tend to very narrowly focus on pollination because pollination is such a fundamental ecosystem service that a lot of insects provide. What's interesting to me, and if you've been in this space at all, you probably can echo this, is for a long time when we talked about insect conservation and decline, we tended to like focus on honeybees, which was a very interesting choice because honeybees are a Eurasian species. They're not native to North America. They are kind of an agricultural livestock in many senses. And while they are experiencing decline for a number of, pest and disease and pesticide reasons, when we talk about conservation of bees in particular, we're really referring to native bees. We're not referring to honeybees because they're not really a part of the natural ecosystem. They're an agricultural commodity. So pollination, hugely important. And we have a number of different species of insects and birds and mammals like bats that provide pollination services as well. So it's not just insects that pollinate, but they are the powerhouses of pollination. Bees in particular, here's a little sweat bee. You can see it, they're kind of built for pollination because they have all of those wonderful hairs all over their body. Some are specialists, some are generalists. They spend their days going from plant to plant. So they're just powerhouses of pollination. And we're seeing massive declines in bees. Butterflies also really important for pollination. You'll see they kind of they have these stilted legs, so as they travel from flower to flower, they're not as powerful as of a pollinator because their hairy bodies aren't necessarily touching down and collecting that collecting that pollen in the same way that the body of bees do. But they're still very important pollinators because they spend their days flitting from flower to flower. Some other ecosystem services that we talked about, predation is a really, really big one. I find it interesting when we talk about insect conservation too, we tend to talk about sort of the desirables and the undesirables. This is the paper wasp, the photo on this particular slide. And wasps tend to be one of those things that we kind of categorize as an undesirable insect, right? Because they're big and scary and they can sting. And but wasps are incredible, not only for pollination, but also for predation. They consume so many different things. Many of them are carnivorous. Many of them collect other insects and what we would consider plant pests to feed to their larvae. So they're like predation powerhouses. Some of them are also parasitoids. So a number of different wasp species will actually parasitize the eggs of other pest species like stink bugs. Of course, it's not just wasps that are important. I mentioned that we can kind of throw spiders into this, into this insect conversation, more broadly talking about the importance of invertebrates in the landscape. Spiders are also really, really important for predation. And I've read research studies that say our food production would collapse without the presence of spiders in things like farm fields and crops. This is a little crab spider. I love them. They hold their legs out like a crab, hence the name. Again, if you follow me, you know that my heart belongs to jumping spiders in particular. This is like such a tiny little jumping spider on a little aster. Jumping spiders are, I think, the most charismatic spiders in the world. They're gateway spiders for a lot of people to overcome arachnophobia. They served as a gateway spider for me in particular to overcome arachnophobia. And they are just wonderful, wonderful for pest control in particular. Here are two syrphid flies, or they're also known as hoverflies or flower flies. And in their larvae form, they're carnivorous. They're predators, many species. So they're also great for pest control. They'll eat little soft-bodied things like aphids and other little caterpillars and larvae of other insects too. Here's an example of a wasp, not sure of the exact species. And you can kind of see its little ovipositor getting ready to lay eggs into these eggs. I think these are assassin bug eggs. I don't know the exact species, but a lot of different wasp species will parasitize eggs by laying their eggs into the eggs of other critters. And then when their eggs hatch into larvae, those larvae actually consume whatever was in that egg, providing wonderful pest control. Here's another example of a little parasitoid wasp laying eggs in brown marmorated stink bug eggs. And I've actually read some research that says that like up to, I think 90%, and I don't know where we're getting that figure from exactly, but it's huge. Up to 90% of brown marmorated stink bug eggs are parasitized before they ever get to hatch, thanks to little insects like wasps. So predation and parasitism, a huge ecosystem service. Here's one of my favorite insects, ambush bug. True bug that is carnivorous. It uses its little straw-like mouth part to stab and basically slurp out the insides of its prey. So really cool. Here's a mantid fly, kind of like a mix between a wasp and a praying mantis. And it also, you can see those nice big raptorial forearms, and it eats things very similar to like a praying mantis. Dragonfly is one of the best aerial predators. They actually have a higher predation rate or a higher success rate for predation than lions, which is just a really cool fun fact. They are so precise with how they capture prey in midair, which is super cool. Insects also really important for decomposition. This is a golden dung fly because it likes to lay its eggs in manure, which is really great for decomposition of manure. This is a green bottlefly, same thing. We tend to call these filth flies. They'll lay their eggs in and around trash or decomposing meat or dead and decaying organic matter, really helping with that nutrient recycling in the ecosystem. So fundamentally important. Without our decomposers, things would have a lot more difficult of a time, like the bacteria and funguses breaking down dead and decaying organic matter to return those nutrients to the soil. So insects are really important for there too. Some of you mentioned things like fundamental parts of the food chain. We know that tons of birds rely on invertebrates to feed their young. Without the nutrient-rich source of things like big juicy caterpillars, the offspring of birds would never survive. So those are really important parts of the food chain as well. Here's an Io moth, beautiful silk moth. They don't eat, they don't even have a mouth in their adult form, but in their larvae form, those big juicy caterpillars, again, serve as a food source for a number of other critters. And honestly, insects create a foundation in many food webs, not just for birds, but for reptiles, amphibians, fish, many small mammals. So a world without insects would mean a world without food for us through pollination, a world without many flowering plants because of pollination, a world without birds and reptiles and amphibians and mammals because that's what they eat. We would have no pest control. We would just be so out of whack without insects, which is why when we talk about conservation of insects in particular is so important. The last one that we will mention here is, and somebody provided it here, Henry said, providing honey. Yes. So while honeybees are not native here in North America, they are an agricultural commodity. Not only do they pollinate things like our blueberries and our almonds, we can easily transport them around the country for the pollination of different crops seasonally as needed, but they can also provide us food like honey. And a number of other insect species like silk moths and certain beetles that provide like shellac and certain beetles that provide dyes for makeup and cosmetics. We get a lot of products from insects, and we don't tend to think about those all the time, but they are important. And here's just a nice close-up of a honeybee. Again, super pollinator because they have all those hairs. They even have hairs coming out of their eye. And you can see those little specks of pollen all over the eye of the honeybee. Beautiful species. But again, as far as conservation is concerned, we shouldn't be putting our attention on honeybees. We should be putting them on native insects that are in decline and that really need conservation attention. So let's take a look at the scope of insects. Here's what we know. There's around 1 million described species of insects. This does not include our spiders. These are just our six-legged wildlife. The really cool part is entomologists think that there could be up to 5 to 10 million species of insects worldwide. And it's mind-boggling to me to consider that there could be that many undescribed species that we don't know. They're not known to science. Some of those we have, like, we know that they exist, but they might not be fully described as in taxonomically classified by science. But it's mind-boggling to me that there are 5 to 10 million types of bugs that we have yet to discover. I think that's just the coolest thing ever, which means those are 5 to 10 million, connections out there in the ecosystem that we're completely unaware of. We're unaware of their importance. We've probably lost so many insect species to extinction because of climate change, because of habitat loss and pesticide use that we'll just never know. We'll never know because we never found them before they were in such steep decline that now they're extinct. So that's really sad. So what are some of the major drivers of decline? We're going to talk about some of these, and then we're going to talk about how to fix it with our own home landscapes. So climate change is a big one of these factors. Agriculture, which really contributes to land use change, right? Like wiping out native ecosystems like forests and wetlands, and prairies and grasslands, and replacing it with monocultures that we're also, oftentimes using pesticides on. And I don't want to demonize pesticides. I really don't, because without pesticides, our food production system would look a lot different. And it's important to recognize that we have a growing global population. So pesticides, I don't want to say that they're a necessary evil per se, but pesticides have given us so much in terms of food production. But there are ways that we can reduce pesticide use and still derive benefit from agriculture. Urbanization, obviously a huge one. This one, again, like agriculture, goes back to land use change. We are filling in wetlands, we are cutting down forests, and we are developing them in cities and landscapes that are massively unsustainable, which we'll talk about. Light pollution is one that we're doing more and more research around, more and more research understanding why light pollution is problematic, not just for insects, but for a lot of different wildlife. And then, of course, invasive species as well. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these. And yes, Vicki mentioned uneducated use of pesticides too. And we'll talk about a little bit more about pesticide use, but in the context of our backyards, our front yards, our home landscapes, and why we just need to think differently about pesticide use in like residential environments. Because that's kind of what we have control over, right? Assuming you're a homeowner, you have a plot of land that you have access to, the use of pesticides, you can control in a space like that. So we will talk a little bit more about that as we go forward tonight. So traditional landscape management, and I'm using that term very deliberately, landscape management, because that term implies a certain sense of superiority over the landscape and a certain sense of control that we humans have created over the landscape. Traditional landscape management is unsustainable. And when I say traditional landscape management, I'm talking about things like growing monocultures of primarily turf grass that are weed-free, that are pest-free, that, have heavy use of carbon-intensive tools like mowers and leaf blowers, heavy use of irrigation. We're spilling water, we are spilling gasoline, we're using so many things that just aren't needed. So not only have we completely wiped out habitats for a lot of different wildlife as we've developed our own housing for humans, but then to add insult to injury, we're continuing to spray pesticides and use fertilizers that are then running off into streams and waterways and causing things like harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie and other waterways throughout Ohio. So much of what we're doing at home doesn't stay at home. You can do something in your backyard, but it's going to affect the whole community. And we see this happening too, even with things like invasive species. How many of you have heard, I see somebody saying talk a little bit slower. I will. When I get excited, I tend to speed up. So I will talk a little bit slower and don't hesitate to remind me about that again. One of the things I often see, and I didn't provide any really context for who I am and how I got to be here. I started my career working for the National Park Service in invasive plant education. And then I started working for Extension. I've spent the last 9 years working for Extension, first as a county educator in environment and natural resources, teaching master gardeners about sustainable horticulture. I now work for the Nature Conservancy professionally, and it is the best organization in the world. I love it. But having spent the early portion of my career working in invasive plant education and outreach, I talked to so many people, so many especially gardeners, who would say things like, I'm growing burning bush in my yard and I'm not going to stop because I don't see it becoming problematic. I don't see it spreading in my yard. There's a good chance that you're not seeing it spread in your yard because you're creating a disturbance regime through mowing or otherwise cutting your grass. And that disturbance regime isn't allowing maybe that invasive plant to become invasive in your cultivated landscape. But what if a bird comes by and eats a berry from an invasive plant like honeysuckle or something else and flies away to a natural area, maybe a little ways away from your home? and drops that seed over there. Now, all of a sudden, we've introduced this invasive plant into a natural area. And because that's not a cultivated landscape with the same type of disturbance regime, those plants can grow really prolifically, and they have. We see that in natural areas, not just here in Ohio, but across the entire North American and global landscape. We're not the only ones experiencing invasive species and invasive plants. Asia and Europe and Africa, they have invasive plants that came from North America too. So it's very much a two-way, kind of a two-way road. All right. So Americans spend somewhere around $30 billion per year on lawn care every year. And if you live in a suburb, totally unsurprising. For context, I live on half an acre in a Worcester, Ohio suburb. It's a beautiful neighborhood. I love it to death. I really do. But I'm surrounded by a lot of homeowners who, every summer in front of their home is, a lawn care company, a pest control company, a landscaper that has a leaf blower in hand or a lawnmower in hand or something. It's no surprise that we're spending this amount of money on lawn care every year. And I have to ask, for what? To what end? It's all in the management of a monoculture of turf grass, because that is what we have been told is aesthetically pleasing. So we have it in our heads that anything other than that beautiful monoculture of turf grass is undesirable. Speaking from experience, we're kind of like the sore thumb that sticks out, because if you drive by our yard, you can see we're the ones that aren't managing our landscape for a monoculture of turf grass. We have a lot of moss in our yard. We have a lot of just not turf grass, basically, right? And sometimes it looks a little scraggly. And I feel bad for our neighbors who sometimes just have to put up with it. But at the same time, I know that I'm doing so much good for the local wildlife. And I'll actually share some photos of my home, and I'll share a little video of some of the wildlife that visit too. I want to come back to this idea of climate change, though, because another one of the arguments that I tend to see people make in defense of turf grass is, well, turf grass sequesters carbon in the same way that a landscape like a forest or a wetland or a natural grassland or prairie would, because that's true. Vegetation sequesters carbon through the process of photosynthesis. But here's the thing. Lawns are, while they can, yes, absorb carbon, we tend to expend more carbon in their management than they are absorbing, which means they're a carbon emitter. They're not a carbon sink like forest and grasslands and wetlands. A carbon sink is an area of land that is actually absorbing more carbon than it releases. So as we cut down forests, particularly large swaths of forest like those in the Amazon, when we're cutting hundreds or thousands of acres at once, those trees store carbon in their roots. They're pulling that carbon down into the soil, and then we're going in and cutting those down. And it doesn't matter if it's the Amazon or if it's here in Ohio or elsewhere, that's releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So we also have to think about things like sustainable forestry. We have to think about sustainable, grassland management, disturbance regimes like fire, that yes, release carbon, but in the benefits of which are a more productive ecosystem in the long run, which help absorb that carbon back down into the soil. On this note would be a good time to talk about the importance of not releasing carbon from your own soil through soil disturbance, which tends to happen when we till. Oftentimes when you are just starting out in gardening and you go on Google and you're like, how do I start a garden? So many articles and resources will say till your soil, or like dredge up your soil. That actually releases carbon into the atmosphere, which is why when we talk about sustainable agriculture, we talk about mechanisms like no-till or using cover crops. So we don't have to continually disturb the soil and release the carbon back into the atmosphere. So if you can do no-till gardening, that's fantastic. If you can, if you have like an area of your landscape that you're like, I really need to, like maybe it's really compacted or something, and you do need to go in and till, consider an alternate mechanism like lasagna gardening, where you kind of start by maybe killing the grass through a layer of cardboard or newspaper, and then you start to layer on like, compost and leaves and compost and leaves, and you're creating new soil on top of that compacted soil, rather than disturbing the compacted soil and releasing carbon. So again, there's all different sorts of things we could talk about tonight. But let's get to kind of the meat of the presentation, which is this idea of homegrown conservation. What is homegrown conservation? This is my own personal definition, and this is kind of the anchor around which I'm writing my book, Homegrown Conservation. It's, in my mind, it is a holistic approach to stewarding our landscapes in ways that are more climate and wildlife friendly. And on that note, I want to mention the reason why I put holistic approach in bold is because historically, when I think about conservation campaigns, especially as they relate to the insect world, instead of looking at a holistic approach, what I tend to see is us creating like poster children of the conservation campaign. And for a long time in the world of insects, that has been the monarch butterfly. How many of you have seen conservation campaigns around the monarch? And you can just type in chat, yes or no. How many, I see raised hands coming up. How many of you have planted milkweed in an effort to help the monarch butterfly? Because that's what we've been told to do, right? Monarchs are in decline, plant their larval host plant, milkweed. Yes, monarchs need milkweed, but here's the thing that is a little bit frustrating. First of all, I will say monarchs are definitely in decline. Milkweed will definitely help that. But when we only focus on a singular species and a singular solution, we're not really approaching this from a systems approach. We're approaching it very kind of single focused. And we need to be thinking about it from a systems approach. Yes, planting milkweed will help the monarchs. And Raymond says monarchs are gateway insects for the uninitiated. Absolutely, which is why we tend to have these poster children of conservation campaigns, is because they're wonderful introductory things. And what I was going to say here is, like, think about the emotional connection that has been built between people and the monarch. The monarch is one of the most charismatic species, not just because it's big and beautiful, but because it's like the most wonderful underdog story, right? This little butterfly, kind of large as far as butterflies go, but this little butterfly relative to other wildlife species flies over 2,000 miles on fragile wings from southern Canada or the Midwest United States all the way down into Mexico, overcoming storms and wind and natural disaster. I mean, it's just the most wonderful story, right? And then I think it's 5 generations later, their offspring or their great-great-great-grandchildren make it back to our gardens the following year. I mean, that's like mind-boggling. Even just saying it gives me chills because it really is a wonderful story. But when we say, let's just save the monarchs, here's what we end up with. Article after article after article of people saying, I found milkweed bugs or milkweed beetles on my milkweed. I need to kill that, right? How do I kill these other species, these other native species that also rely on this plant as a host? You know, we're planting milkweed not for other things, we're planting it for monarchs alone. And again, that's part of the problem, is we need to think about it from a systems approach in a way that's a little bit more holistic, and in a way that supports the entire ecosystem and not just a singular species. And planting milkweed alone isn't going to necessarily take care of some of the other issues that are affecting monarchs, like increased threats from severe weather events that could put them at risk in their overwintering habitat in Mexico. And oftentimes that's caused by climate change. It's not going to take care of the lack of habitat and nectaring plants that they have along their entire migratory pathway throughout like the Great Plains states. It's not going to take care of the pesticide use in our ag fields that could also be putting them at risk of further decline. So again, whole systems approach. And we can think about our landscapes, even though they're a much smaller landscape, we can think about it in the same way. Let's think about our home landscapes as being an ecosystem. And if your home, sorry, my cat just jumped on my desk. If your home is an ecosystem, what are some of the processes that are happening? So homegrown conservation is this idea that we are striving to be a part of nature instead of setting ourselves apart from it, which is what traditional landscape management does, right? Let's douse our yard proactively, preventatively with pesticide because I don't want spiders near me. I don't want, ants or wasps or anything else near me. I should also say there's a time and a place for some pesticides in the home landscape. Like if you are at risk of termites, don't wait until your foundation has been eaten and your house is caving in. Like there are certain situations that do kind of, need us to think about the use of pesticides and control of certain species. But generally, we shouldn't be like managing for things like wasps unless it becomes, a problem. So we're going to talk about these 7 ideas: the importance of learning about your landscape, lessening the lawn, planting native, eliminating invasives, leaving the leaves, flip the switch on light pollution, and then reducing pesticides. These are sort of 7 of the 20 or so chapters in the book that I'm writing. So it's just a snapshot of a much broader conversation, but these are the ones I think that are most relevant to insects and pollinators in particular. And I think some of the ones that are just really accessible for people to start thinking about. So the first one is the importance of learning about your landscape. And this might not happen overnight. I think for a lot of people, understanding the tendencies and the processes that are happening in your landscape can maybe take, it could maybe even take years, but certainly an entire year through the seasons, kind of understanding how your landscape changes, identifying the plant species that are growing, identifying your areas of sun and shade is really important. When we moved into this home 7 years ago, I wanted it to just be like one great big prairie garden. We have 2 mature oak trees in the front yard, 1 in the back, in addition to pine trees flanking either side of our house. We have a lot of shade. Planting a prairie garden didn't make a lot of sense. But I was like, oh, but I want to support pollinators and insects. So of course I want a prairie garden. We've kind of shifted, and now we're trying to steward our landscape to be more of a forest habitat. And in the areas where we have enough sunlight, we're creating pollinator gardens there. But I recognize it was kind of silly to fight against the natural tendencies of my landscape and all the shade that we have and try to plant, a sun-loving prairie. Identify whether you have drainage issues. When we moved here, we had some significant drainage issues that we had to fix. Identify the wildlife resources, identify the wildlife that are currently using your landscape. What food are you providing? What shelter or habitat? Do you have sources of water? Answer some of the questions like that. And again, that might happen over the course of an entire year once you get through all 4 seasons. I'm going to share a video. Deer, Karen, you'll see deer here in this video. Donald asked, did I take all of the photos myself? Most of the photos in the presentation I've taken myself. Yes, there are a couple stock photos once we get into like the grass-based landscapes that you'll see are not mine. But I wanted to share this little video compilation. All of these videos came from, I think 3 of them were taken on January 1st and a couple were taken on January 6th, just last week. All of these were taken in the last like 2 weeks. We put up a trail cam on Christmas Day because we saw footprints in the snow on our front porch that looked like they came from a fox. Mind you, I have never seen a fox in my yard, but we were like, what if there are like, what if foxes are coming into our landscape but we just don't know it because they're coming at night? We ended up putting up a trail cam that we had and we haven't used for years and years. And this is what we found just in the last 2 weeks. I hope this video plays well for you. Talking about deer. They're going for our bird feeders, by the way. I'll come back to that one because it was very hard to see. Here's a little bunny. And my personal favorite, because raccoons are one of my favorite animals. Now, before I go further, okay, so this is going to be hard to see. Hopefully after the deer, does everybody see that little animal jumping through the yard? At first I was like, is that a frog? Like in the middle of winter? And it took me a couple of views. This is a little flying squirrel jumping through our yard. All of these visited at night. Yep, usually in the middle of the night. So we're not seeing them during the day. And what's funny is I had no idea that this diversity of mammals in particular were visiting our landscape until I got a bird feeder camera. And the first night we had that bird feeder camera, the raccoons knocked it down. And I was like, oh my gosh, we have raccoons that visit our yard at night. And then came the skunk, and then came the flying squirrel. Like we had all these animals that were visiting us every single night. We had no idea. So now that we know, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have like a full forest of animals that are visiting our little half-acre suburb, that's surrounded by nothing but development. this is pretty incredible. And it was really eye-opening and awesome to learn that, but we would have never known had we not put up a camera. So if you're in a position, you know, to put up a trail cam or something, you might be really surprised by what you learn. I'm trying to figure out how to skip this video and go to the next slide. There we go. What's interesting here is all of those animals that you just saw. The lawn is covered in fallen leaves. Yeah, so we leave our leaves. This goes back to a conversation that we'll have in a minute too. We do leave our leaves over the winter. In the backyards, in our backyard, we just leave the leaves where they lie. In our front yard, I'll tell you how we manage those, and you'll get to see a photo of what we just started doing this past year. Most of those animals, though, that you just saw, raccoon, skunk, maybe except the flying squirrel, the deer, the bunnies, oftentimes those are considered the undesirables, right? They're things that eat, like especially the deer and the rabbits, those eat plants that we're planting. So why would we want them in our yard? Well, I want them in my yard because they belong here, because they were here before this was a development, and we're inviting them back into our landscape and providing plants. And, you know, we're purposely planting fruiting and flowering plants for them to eat because they need something to eat. Tyler says the southern flying squirrels are the most numerous species of squirrel in Ohio. I too was absolutely astonished when I learned that last year. I had no idea because I had never seen one, certainly not in our home landscape. And I was like, this can't be true. It is true, but they come out at night and we tend to not see them. So if you can learn about your landscape and what it's supporting, that's a great way to get started. The second thing, lessen your lawn. If you have read any of Doug Tallamy's books, particularly one of his newer books, Nature's Best Hope, you probably know or have learned that he has put out a call for people to replace 50% of their lawn with native plants. This is a great goal. And it's just that. Think of it as a goal, not an overnight thing that you have to go out and do like tomorrow or this year, because depending on how much land you live on, that could be a lot of acreage or a lot of area to try and replace with native plants, which can be very expensive, very time consuming, but it is a great goal to have. Here in the US, we have about 50 million acres of lawn. 40% of this comes from our residential landscapes, 20% in roadsides. So we see that being mowed all the time on the sides of highways, 3% in golf courses, and then the remaining is like public parks, fields, areas like that. And Janine asks, is there an advantage to having rabbits? I don't know if I would say that there's an advantage to having rabbits, other than I personally love rabbits. My boys call them hoppers. Every rabbit that we see we name it Hopper. I think my kids think it's all the same one, but we have multiple. I personally just love them. I love having them in the landscape. I don't know that they necessarily provide benefit other than eating some of the broadleaf weeds that grow in our landscape because we're not managing it for turf grass. They do provide, unfortunately, a food source for other, predators. But again, then people would ask, well, why would you want predators in a suburban landscape? Karen said, as you get great horned owls. Exactly. I mean, you could get predatory species like that. I know there's people that are like, we shouldn't have fox and coyotes in our suburban landscape because they are a risk to maybe small dogs or outdoor cats. Outdoor cats are also problematic. And that is a very controversial thing to say, but I have 5 cats myself, all indoors. And cats are one of the biggest predators of songbirds, and one of the biggest reasons why our songbirds are in decline, in addition to things like window strikes as well. But I think that everything just has a place in the natural world. When we think of things as being advantageous, again, that's a very human perspective, which is something that I'm actively trying to move away from. This well, if they're not advantageous to me, then I don't need them or I shouldn't attract them. I just like everything. Rabbit poop is a great fertilizer too. Excellent point. So other reasons why we should get rid of the lawn: it wastes water, particularly in areas of the country that, go through drought or dry periods like the entire West. Trying to maintain a monoculture of turf grass makes no sense. It also creates very harmful emissions through things like 2-stroke mowers and leaf blowers, which I will say right here and now, I hate leaf blowers, which is why we should leave the leaves. Using this kind of lawn care equipment also produces gas spills. And when we maintain a monoculture of grass, it tends to require pesticides, or at least herbicides that we're, managing things like dandelions. Dandelions are also non-native. We do have some native mountainous species, but the ones that grow in our yard are non-native. But there's not usually a reason to treat them other than pure human aesthetics. So lawn care is unsustainable. I could talk way more about, why we could get into like the stats of the emissions and things like that. We don't have time for that tonight, but here's what I will say. You can adopt a lazy landscaping approach to turf grass. If you're not in a position to just go out and rip it up and replace it with native plants, there are still ways that you can be sustainable. Part of that is, yes, reducing the lawn. The other part is mowing less frequently. We have campaigns like No Mow May, which is really wonderful. We here in our yard, we also have like No Mow June and No Mow July, because most of what we have in our landscape is not grass at all. It's low growing species like moss. I love moss, by the way. Moss is one of those, like, you either love it or you hate it. I love it because it's like management free. It's also a little fragile. So when my kids are out playing in the front yard, sometimes they, rip it up by accident, but it's so pretty and it does so well under the shade of our oak trees. So if I could just have like a moss landscape, I would do that in a heartbeat. Learn to appreciate the weeds in your yard. This could be little things like violets or other little, flowering like clover. That can help the bees, but it can also mean that you have to manage your lawn less, which can be more sustainable. And leave a little bit of bare soil. If you have an area of your yard that like, oh, the grass isn't doing super well, particularly if it's an area that doesn't get like a lot of people like walking across it, leave it for the bees, because we have a significant number of ground nesting bees that will nest underground. This is why I say only if it's not like a well-traversed area of your landscape, because you don't want to invite bees into an area where like your kids are playing. I'm going to skip a couple slides for time. I want to talk about planting native. I don't want to spend a ton of time here because this has been the dominant narrative when we talk about pollinator support. And there are a couple other points that I want to get to. We know that native plants are superior to non-native plants in their ability to support pollinators and other wildlife. Reason being, our wildlife evolved for millennia alongside these native plants. So when we just remove them from the landscape and put in a non-native plant that our wildlife doesn't recognize, doesn't know, has no previous association with, and then we're like, well, why won't the deer just eat the garlic mustard? Well, because it didn't evolve to eat garlic mustard, right? It would be like saying, why doesn't the monarch butterfly just eat this invasive plant that we put in? Because the monarch butterfly larvae evolved some very specific behavioral and physiological mechanisms to be able to eat milkweed, which a lot of things can't eat because that sap is so thick and gluey that it physically glues their mouths shut. Monarchs can get by that because they've evolved to be able to eat this. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, the wildlife will learn to eat it. No, they won't. They'll probably die. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So which plants are the best? This is going to depend on your location, the sunlight, the drainage, your soil type. It's also going to depend largely on your time, your energy, the resources, and what you want to put into this. I'm going to skip the conversation about prairie gardens. It's important. The only thing I wanted to say here really is that, like in my landscape, we wanted to plant prairie gardens and we very quickly realized this doesn't make a ton of sense to do a whole landscape of prairie garden because of the shade that we have. So instead, we're really fostering our landscape as a woodland and then planting little like pockets of pollinator gardens where we have enough sunlight to do so. And I'll kind of show you in an aerial photo here in a minute what that looks like. Of course, we want to plant for long bloom periods, different life cycles of insects. We want to provide various habitats and then plant a mix of woody and herbaceous plants. I'm not going to show you these guides, but the thing that I wanted to point out is if you're wondering what specific plant species you should plant, the Pollinator Partnership and the Xerces Society both offer wonderful native plant guides. I'm partial to the Pollinator Partnership guides because they really, instead of just being statewide, they're more ecoregion based. And the Pollinator Partnership guide for Ohio, I think there's 2 that span Ohio. They have such an abundance of resources and information in those guides. So I highly recommend you check those out. You can just put in your zip code and it will give you exactly which guide is relevant to your ecoregion. Are nativars okay to plant? There's a lot of controversy around this conversation. And there's some people like the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware doing research on nativars. And nativar is a native plant that was cultivated for specific traits. In some cases, those traits were specific bloom types or color or leaf color. Generally, straight species tend to perform better for pollinator visitation. But there are a couple of cases where the native cultivar actually outperformed straight species. Generally, general statement, it's best to, if you can, purchase and plant native plants that were propagated from seed or from plants that were found in your ecoregion, which usually means going to a native plant nursery, like a local native plant nursery that specializes in native plants, as opposed to going to your big box retailer and buying native plants there, because sometimes what's labeled as native in those big box stores isn't even native to your state. If it's native to like America, they'll list it as native. So we have to be aware of some things like that. So my cat is trying to like open my cupboard now. If you hear weird noises, I apologize. In the same conversation, we talk about planting natives. Try to identify any invasive plants that you have in your yard. Here's some common ones in the state of Ohio. I know we have people joining us from all over right now. So think about like do a Google search for like invasive plants in your state, and you're likely to find like a Department of Agriculture or Department of Natural Resources list of invasive plants. Here's a couple for Ohio. Here's a few species that tend to be very popular in the landscape industry. Calorie pear, also known as Bradford pear. We'll talk about that in a minute. Barberry, Dame's rocket, burning bush we mentioned. Our non-native honeysuckles, we do have some native varieties, autumn olive, Russian olive. In 2018, the state of Ohio declared 38 plants invasive. On that list included calorie pear, and as of this year, as of like a week and a half ago, Bradford pear is now illegal to sell, propagate, plant in the state of Ohio, which is a huge win in my book, because if you know anything about calorie pear, you know it's very prolific, and it's taken over very, very large areas. So I'm thrilled to see that we're saying like no to it. We're saying don't plant it. Leave the leaves. This is always a really important one. Leaving your leaves in your landscape, particularly, this is actually a view of my street, looking down my street. We have just rows of pin oaks lining our street, which is one of my favorite things about the neighborhood, is the tree coverage that we have. You can imagine the amount of leaves that we have, though. Leaving your leaves provides important overwintering habitat for a number of species. It helps recycle nutrients, which gives back to the soil. It helps create a moisture barrier and reduce erosion, and it increases soil health overall. But people are always like, well, what do I do with all these leaves? This is a sort of an aerial view looking down at my house, and you'll see how we managed our leaves this year. I decided, let's stop like raking our leaves onto tarps and taking them into our backyard, and let's leave them in the front yard. Let's create very nice, well-defined borders under our oak trees, and we'll rake the leaves in there, and we'll plant little woodland gardens in there. And this strip that you see right on the left side of our driveway, we are trying to kill any remaining grass, and this is going to be planted as a little prairie strip this year, which I'm super excited about. And this whole bed in front of our house up here is pollinator garden, and an area that we're actively planting pollinator plants in. So that's how we're managing that. Couple final words here. Reducing light pollution in the landscape is pretty easy. This can consist of something as easy as just shutting off your lights at night. If you have a security light that can go on a motion sensor, that's great. If you live in an area where security is an issue, maybe think twice about that. But if you do have the ability to turn that on a motion sensor, that's great. Also, drawing your blinds or shutting your curtains at night can be really great, so that the light from inside your house doesn't create light pollution. And the reason being is because we have a lot of nocturnal species like fireflies. This was a photo of synchronous fireflies that I took in the Great Smokies a couple of years ago. But we also have species here like the Luna moth, and a number of aquatic species that need dark skies in order to fulfill their life cycle. So shutting off those lights is really, really important. This was a photo that I took actually here in Ohio of a population of synchronous fireflies down in Southern Ohio. So it's pretty incredible. I have like 1 minute left, which is good because we're almost done here. Reducing your pesticides or eliminating your use of pesticides, we can use integrated pest management for this rather than proactively or preventatively applying pesticides in your landscape. You know, I like to say inspect, detect, connect, and then reflect and correct. Inspect your yard for any problems. If you do find problems, identify them, make sure that you have properly identified them. You can contact your local extension educator or agent to help you identify any issues. If you think that you do have something, get help from experts and then reflect on your best way forward. But don't just go out there and be like, oh, I have a problem, I'm gonna like spray the heck out of my yard because I'm worried about something. Make sure that you know exactly what you're treating for. And then, take the most appropriate course of action, because homeowners statistically apply more pesticides per hectare to their home environment than farmers apply to crops. And at least what we're getting from agriculture is food to fill our dinner plate. Our grass landscapes aren't providing anything for us. A lot of people are asking what I do with my leaves in the spring. Those leaves under the oak trees in those garden beds will just stay there. And we'll see what happens. Oak leaves take a little while to break down, but we hope that they're just going to stay there. So to wrap up, homegrown conservation doesn't have to be super hard. Small steps are still steps in the right direction. Don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. There's no one size fits all approach to this work. Take some of what you learned throughout this whole webinar series and apply it. Do what makes sense for you and let nature be your guide. The last thing I want to say is this: climate change and loss of biodiversity are not just environmental issues, they are social justice issues, they are people issues. So climate change and biodiversity loss exist at this nexus of a lot of social justice issues. This is a photo of my son at Browns Lake Bog. If you've ever been to Wayne County here in Ohio, we have a wonderful preserve. We absolutely love it. And this is the final thing I'll say. When we steward our landscapes for nature and wildlife, we steward our landscapes for people too. People are a part of nature, and when we save nature, we save ourselves. So that is what I have. I am 2 minutes over. I am happy to stay on to help answer any questions that you all might have, but thank you for being here tonight and for bearing with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Danae. We really appreciate you coming on and kicking off our 2023 webinar series. Such a great start.
Thank you.
I know everybody is cheering and showing their admiration from home. It's a little underwhelming when you're on a Zoom, but I think there's 320 people out there, and they're thanking you in the chat box. So make sure to
Thank
read
you.
that as well. And yeah, you got a little visitor there too. That's
I do.
awesome.
He waited until the end. Normally he's right up in my face the whole time I'm on a Zoom, but he waited. He's very, very good.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
So yeah, if you want, we'll try to answer a few questions. Remember, don't use the chat bots for questions. You can send encouraging messages and stuff. We'll make sure to read all of those as well. But if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A box. Maybe we'll answer just a handful of questions here, and I'll let you take a look at them, Danae, and pick which ones you prefer.
Yeah, I'll go with one of the easy ones first. Reese asked, what camera am I using to take a lot of my photos? I use 2 different camera setups. For anything that was like a landscape view, I'm using just a Canon 5D, normally with a macro lens on it, or with just like a wider angle 50mm lens. For all of my super close up macro images, I'm using mostly a reverse lens setup. So I have a Canon 90D SLR, and I am reverse mounting, which sounds counterintuitive, but it provides high magnification macro photography. Reverse mount a 40mm prime lens with a special adapter, and you can take some really just close up incredible photos. I have more information on my website at chasingbugs.com if you're interested in that camera setup. And feel free to just reach out if you have questions too. I'm happy to walk through photography setups.
Awesome.
Right. A couple of questions. Mary asked, what plants would you suggest to help the broadest number of native insects? Great question. There are so many. I mean, we could talk about this based on ecosystem, but I will say, and this is if you haven't read Doug Tallamy's books, read them, because he is fabulous. He's been my biggest idol in this space and biggest influence in this space. And his research has shown that oak trees, and I think cherries, oaks in particular, attract the greatest number of lepidopterans. That would be butterflies and moths. And we know that butterflies and moths not only are great in and of themselves, but they're also really wonderful for birds, because birds will eat the caterpillars. So if you want something that is really great for insects, plant an oak tree. And I know not everybody has the land for that, but oak trees are wonderful. I'm looking through some of the other questions here. Any quick tips for dealing with drainage issues? Yeah, when we first moved into our home, the previous owners had put in a beautiful koi pond, which was great as a water resource, but it was surrounded by a lot of non-native plants. like aquatic stuff that they put in. And it created some significant drainage issues in our yard because it was in an area that was already so wet and that stayed wet year round. And the pond was poorly constructed. It leaked and created further drainage issues. We actually had to have somebody come out and like snake the drain down to the road. And then we tore out the pond. Like broke my heart to tear out this pond, but we tore it out, we filled it in, and we planted a beautiful native woodland garden in that space. So if you have the capacity to put in something like a rain garden to help soak up some of that excess water, that's wonderful. Think about like a bioswale or a rain garden or something like that. And again, you're creating habitat while also helping to deal with your drainage issues. So that's how we did it. Susan asks, is a great question. Are violets more environmentally beneficial than grass in your lawn? I mean, anything that's like flowering and can provide habitat and like nectaring plants or, pollen for insects and other pollinators is going to be preferable for wildlife. But the other thing that I will say, and I'm seeing this conversation happen a lot in conservation circles, is lots of people have called for things like replacing turf grass with clover. And then I've also seen people say, well, a monoculture of clover is no better than a monoculture of turf. I don't know that I would agree with that, because at least clover is flowering, so you can provide like a food source for pollinators. But I agree that a monoculture of anything is not the best solution. So I think if you have violets, but also have, a number of other things happening in your landscape, that's probably best. Maybe we can do, it's 8:07. Maybe we can do like one more question, Andrew. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's great.
There's a lot of good questions here. And I know I can't get to them all. And there's some plant specific questions here. I will be perfectly transparent saying I'm not a botanist, so I'm not the best person to say like, what should I plant like for this particular habitat. I will say that those planting guides from Pollinator Partnership and Xerces, wonderful. I love this question because I got it a lot. Donald asked, any tips for preventing your leaves from blowing away? Surprisingly, the leaves that we put in these little sections of our garden have not blown away. And we have had some pretty big windstorms since we did that. I think the rain really helped keep them in place. And then we just bought little landscaping bricks that we used to section those off. And they did a fabulous job of keeping the leaves in place. I was honestly surprised. This was a bit of an experiment for us, and I was expecting it to go awry. And it still might. We have plenty of time for things to go south, but so far it is doing exactly what I intended it to do. And it looks really cool too. Like if you saw, that landscape photo, I think it looks good. My neighbors might be like, I hate this, but you know what? I love it. I think it's great. So I think that's it for the questions. I know there's more in here, but please, what is the name of the book and when does it come out? I think somebody asked about publisher. Timber Press is publishing. This is a dream come true. Timber Press is my favorite publisher in the world. So when they reached out, I like basically died. I'm super excited. It will not come out until like 2025 though. I don't owe them my manuscript and photos until January 1st of 2024. So this is my writing year. And then it will be like in production design for probably about 18 months after that. So look for it in like 2025. You can follow me at Chasing Bugs on Facebook or TikTok. And I'll be sure to update you all when it's available.
We'll make sure to spread the news about that too.
Thank you. I appreciate
with our community.
that.
So yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sticking with us tonight. We're really excited about this year's webinar. We have 4 more good ones just like this coming up. So we'll see you back here in 2 weeks. You should get directed to a survey as soon as we close out of this webinar. So again, appreciate it. It takes about 2 minutes to fill that out. Appreciate you filling it out, and you should get a reminder about a day before on the 24th, letting you know that you're signed up for the next webinar. So we will see you in 2 weeks. And Danae, again, can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Bye everyone.